So, this meeting is intended to give us a chance for us to update you on Mendelian randomization studies and on the policies that PLOS One has developed to deal with these studies. Jenny, my co-host Jenny is here today. Can you just keep inviting people who join in the waiting room, please? This is going to be partly us updating you on our policies, but it also gives us a chance to chat with you and to get your input and suggestions when it comes to this study type, because you are the experts who handle these studies sort of in more regularly. And we are going to have multiple options throughout the meeting with little polls and breaks to discuss topics, but we'll also have the Q&A section running. So please feel free to put any questions you want into the Q&A chat and we'll try to respond to them. At the end of the meeting, there's going to be a survey that pops up in your browser when you exit the webinar, and we'd be really grateful if you could fill out the survey, because that gives you a chance to let us know what you think of the webinars and any ideas that you have, and it lets us know how we've done and if you enjoy these sort of events. Then we can dive into the topic. My name is Joanna. I'm an associate editor with PLOS One, and my colleague Jenny, who I've mentioned, she's in the background helping me run this webinar. To give you a quick idea of what we're going to go through, first we're just going to have a really brief overview about what Mendelian randomization studies are. This is not per se the topic of the webinar because you're all familiar with the study type, but makes sense to just run a little bit of background. And then we really want to discuss with you the policies. So first of all, the challenges that we are facing, because the study type per se is not the problem, but there are certain challenges that come with it. And we would like to share with you the policies that we already have in place to ensure that the submissions are of sufficient quality and that quite robust done. And also talk to you about the policies that we currently have in development and sort of get your input on this to know if these would be helpful and if you consider them a good addition. And then we really should have time for some questions and answers. And some of you have used the Q&A feature at registration, so we know that there are a few topics that make sense to address, so we can do this in the end as well. If we do not get to some of the questions, we will do our very best to respond to them later via email. And so first, speaking of Mendelian randomization studies, Mendelian randomization per se is a method that allows you to study the causal effect of a modifiable exposure on any type of outcome. That can be health, social, or economic, and it uses genetic variants that are robustly associated with the specific exposure of interest. Now, in theory, if this is well done, this allows to estimate the relationship between the outcome and the risk factor with less confounding and bias than conventional epidemiological approaches. So, in theory, it's a really good method that can be used to sort of estimate these risk factors and their consequences. What this means, what this looks like, is basically if you just look at this graph, we have with X and Y, we have the exposure X and the outcome of interest Y. There are different variables that can affect X and Y. They are denoted as C and U in this graph. These are potential confounding factors. And we have the variable G, which is the genetic variant of interest. And that instrumental variable can be used to then establish the causal effect of X, the exposure, on Y, the outcome. And in order to do this properly, it needs to fulfill three different assumptions. The first being the relevance assumption, which means that G, the genetic variant of interest, is robustly associated with X. That is essential. If this isn't given, the study type cannot be performed. The genetic variant of interest also cannot share a common cause with the confounding factors, so C and U in this case. Because there can't be this is the independence or exchangeability assumption. And finally, G can only affect Y, the outcome, through the effect on X, the exposure. So it has to be sort of a straight effector here. And what this looks like in practice, this is a good example here. This Mendelian randomization study looks at maternal pregnancy exposure, for example, alcohol, on the offspring outcome, for example, cognitive function. So this is our exposure and outcome. We have the maternal genetic instrumental variable, which is robustly associated with the exposure, which is, again, the alcohol consumption, for example. And you can see on top with the dotted lines, these are potential confounding factors being socioeconomic position and lifestyle, both of the family and the offspring. And you can see that these would be confounding at various levels of the Mendelian randomization study. So for things like this, there are methods in place that can control for these quite effectively, but it has to be considered during the study design. Going back to the three assumptions that have to be fulfilled, we've said relevance. So in this case, this would be that the maternal genetic instrumental variable is then robustly related to the intrauterine exposure. There's the exclusion restriction. So the confounders of the maternal exposure offspring outcome association, they cannot be associated with the instrumental variable. And the independence association, where we say that the maternal genetic instrumental variable is not associated with the offspring outcome, other than potentially through the association with the intrauterine exposure. This is basically how the logic behind every Mendelian randomization study is built up. And these studies can be generally used to assess a whole wide variety of exposure and outcome associations. They're not necessarily restricted to just clinical research. So this is a non-exhaustive example of various options where good Mendelian randomization studies have been performed. And you can see that the application ranges from clinical studies to behavioral studies, socioeconomic studies, but they can also be applied to environmental factors and molecular traits. So as long as reasonable data exists, this study type can be expanded over a whole variety of topics. And that sort of leads to the actual problem that we often encounter with this study type, because it is so easy to apply and it can be applied on so many topics. The submission volumes of Mendelian randomization studies are rapidly rising. They're through the roof. And this is not just something that PLOS One is experiencing. This applies to pretty much any journal that is out there. And as often when the submission values explode like this, there are concerns that go hand in hand with it. And for example, in the case of the MR studies, we've had editors and reviewers raise concerns regarding the quality of these studies and if they actually contribute to academic knowledge. And because there are so many, so this is just to show you what we mean by rising submission volume. This is a graph taken from Dimensions, just looking at published Mendelian randomization studies. And you see that in 2016, there were maybe 200 published. And in 2024, this skyrocketed up to 7,500 publications. So they have just been absolutely exploding. And at PLOS One specifically, in the year 2024, we had over 1,800 submissions of Mendelian randomization studies, out of which only 1% reached acceptance state. So this gives you an idea that these studies tend to have certain flaws, and we need to put policies in place to just make sure that what we publish is robust and good science. So the goal that we have at PLOS One is that we really want to make sure that the MR studies that we do publish are following robust methodology and that this study contributes to academic knowledge. And you know that as PLOS One is a sound science journal, the only requirement really that we have for publication is that they are in line with our publication criteria. So if we look at Mendelian randomization studies, there are certain challenges that we face in assessing them when it comes to our publication criteria. And I am sure you are all very familiar with our publication criteria, but the ones where we often see the biggest sort of room for improvement would be, for example, publication criteria 2, which is the results reported have not been published elsewhere. And it's not necessarily that Mendelian randomization studies that are being submitted to PLOS One exist in exactly that shape and form. However, we do, in order to fulfill that criteria, we really want these studies to address a defined and unique research question, and that the investigation of the topic should contribute to academic knowledge. This falls a bit under the logic of just because a question can be asked, it doesn't necessarily make sense to ask it. And there's often the asked and answered challenge, because even if the methodology is slightly different, a lot of these Mendelian randomization studies tend to just pick up a research question or a study hypothesis that has been addressed and answered with different methodology in the past. For example, the relationship between female reproductive factors and breast cancer, or the effect of smoking on laryngeal cancer. These are topics that have been studied, so it can be questioned if another Mendelian randomization study that proposes a certain association between these factors is actually contributing anything to the scientific knowledge. And sort of falling into the same publication criteria, we would expect our authors to always refer to the relevant previously published work and also highlight the significance of their own research in comparison with existing literature, because this feeds into the previous points. We do want science that we publish to contribute, and if there is nothing that distinguishes you from very similar research, then it raises questions about sort of the study question, really, in basically. Then we can move on to publication criteria 3, which is the trickiest one, I would say, with Mendelian randomization studies. And the publication criteria is that experiments, statistics, and other analysis are performed to a high technical standard and that they are described in sufficient detail. Now, this is very tricky with Mendelian randomization studies because there is a whole lot of different methodology out there that addresses the need for these 3 key assumptions that we've discussed in the beginning, and that addresses the statistical analysis. And it is quite challenging to keep track of the newly developing methods, as well as sort of which exact method is suitable for which exact research question that is being posed. And this is difficult for us to evaluate, this is difficult for our reviewers to evaluate, and this is very difficult for our academic editors to evaluate. So we're trying to find good ways of how to properly assess these studies. Now, obviously, when our authors submit going in line with this publication criteria, we really want them to consider the methodological aspects with care. Because, as mentioned, if you just want to do a really superficial MR study, this can be incredibly easy to perform, because all you need is that genome-wide association study data set. And there are more and more of these coming out because it is so much easier to perform big data kind of studies. And the relevant R script. And you can just run basically any association through the R script, and it will give you, or any hypothesis, and it will give you the relevant numbers that you can write up into a manuscript. But that isn't necessarily methodologically robust. So in order to be in line with this publication criteria, we need, again, the authors to provide a focused study hypothesis. They also have to give us a good match. They have to provide a good match between the research question and the GWAS data set that they are using, because certain things cannot be looked at in every data set, because populations, for example, are different. If you want to look at the association of, let's say, a high-fat diet and breast cancer, then you need to find a population that is where it actually makes sense to study this in. So often there is a mismatch between the GWAS data set that is used in the research question. And of course, we need them to avoid errors in the methodological approach. And this is really important for ensuring that the submissions that we get are of sufficient quality, because this is a bit of the problem with the superficial nature of some of these analyses, where the authors just follow the R script, but don't necessarily consider each individual step in the script if this is the appropriate methodology for the question that they are asking. And this is a really important point that we'll get back to later. It would make sense if the authors propose an association if they also performed a degree of validation. And what that validation means is something we will discuss in a little bit, because this feeds into a policy we're trying to develop. Now, of course, there's publication criteria 4. Conclusions are presented in an appropriate fashion and are supported by the data. Now, in order to go in line with that publication criteria, authors must take care to not overstate their conclusions. And this is important with these Mendelian randomization studies, especially in the absence of validation. You have to be careful in how much weight you sort of put on the results that you find. They have to critically discuss the conclusions in light of recent literature findings. They also have to critically discuss potential confounding variables and other limitations inherent to the study design. A classic thing for this, for example, is in the earlier times of Mendelian randomization studies, the FinTech GWAS was used for a lot of research questions, which is basically just the Finnish population. And the Finnish population is quite homogeneous and not necessarily the most generalizable population, because they have certain genetic specificities. So if you do this, when you use it, then you have to discuss in the limitations that this might not be generalizable. This is something that needs to be discussed. And so it's really important that the authors consider these aspects. Now, that sort of segues nicely into the policies that we have in place at PLOS One. And at this point, I'd just like to reiterate that every single manuscript that we get goes through a series of checks performed by members of staff before we consider inviting one of you to handle the manuscript. And in case of the Mendelian randomization studies, one of these checks is that we ask authors to provide a fully completed strobe MR checklist. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the strobe MR checklist. It's basically a checklist that is designed to enhance the robust reporting for MR checklists. So it has a point-by-point list where authors need to provide details about the methodology that they've chosen, how they came about with the research question, how the sample size is calculated, and a lot of details like this. So, Jenny, if you could just quickly open the poll for the strobe MR checklist, it would be great if you could let us know if you have used the strobe MR checklist to inform your decision when you're handling MR studies, or if you would consider using it if you haven't used it so far, because that will help us sort of understand if it is a helpful thing that we request the authors to provide this whenever possible. What this also means is that every single submission that does proceed to AE handling, where we invite you to take care of them, should have this strobe MR checklist attached. It should never progress to you if this isn't provided. Okay, and I can see in the poll the answers are slowly coming in, but the majority of you has used or would at least consider using the strobe MR checklist. That's really good to know, because that sort of validates why we are, or it validates that we have put this policy in place. At this point, also, if anyone has any experience with the strobe MR checklist, if there is something that you think is worth sharing with everyone else, please feel free to unmute and just let us know. Otherwise, you can also include the questions at the end or any comments in the survey that will open after the meeting. Right, if there is nothing, I will just end the poll. All right. And then we can continue. The second editorial policy that we already have in place is that every one of these studies is just being assessed for sort of a bare minimum of methodological consideration. And I can't tell you the exact details because they're editorial policies, but this looks at things, for example, if the significant threshold for the SNPs passes genome-wide significance. So we are just, while we are not necessarily able to evaluate all the complex aspects of the statistical analysis that are being performed, we are having a look at the basics to ensure that the studies are done to a degree of robustness. Now, we do think that MR studies have value. We don't consider them categorically problematic, because they absolutely have value as part of evidence triangulation, and they can be very good in sort of generating a hypothesis and providing a preliminary idea of what is relevant. But we also think that in the most cases, they would be more robust and the results more trustworthy if they're accompanied by a degree of validation. And we've mentioned this in the past, in the previous slides. But the question then remains, what is appropriate validation? And this is something where we really could use your input on, because you are the experts in the field, and it would be great to hear what you actually consider, if you consider that validation is necessary and would be beneficial, and what you would actually consider appropriate validation. We have thought about it for a while, and we've come up with sort of six different ways of how we could look at what validation would be. I'm just going to go through them one by one, and then we have another one of these polls where it would just be great for you if you could just click what you think does count as appropriate validation, so we can get a feeling for what the preferences would be. First, the authors could perform validation just using a second GWAS data set, but following basically the same methodology. Second would be validating with a different type of publicly available data set. This can be done through RNA-seq experiments that exist, or databases like NANES, just other publicly available data. The third one would be performing validation using data that is derived from clinical or observational studies. Fourth would be to do original research, either in vitro or in vivo, to just validate the associations that the MR study suggests. And if there is no data or experimental setup available for some reason, at the very least, to critically discuss the findings in context of the information that already exists, and then obviously something else. So, Jenny, if you could start the second poll, it would be really good to know what you think. Also, feel free, again, if you have thoughts about this, to unmute and to share it with us. This is also a question that might come up, that has come up in the survey at the end. So if you have anything more specific, or if you have anything that you would like to add, we'd be happy to read it in the survey. And this is also something that we can discuss in the Q&A at the end. This is interesting if you're looking at the results of the poll come in, because the opinions are quite spread throughout the different responses. We're going to keep this open for a bit, just to give everyone a chance to read through it and to provide a response. And again, feel free to unmute and let us know if you've missed something obvious, if there's something else that you think would be critical. I'm going to leave the poll open for a bit longer if anyone else wants to provide a response, while we are going to continue with the presentation. So with the policies that we've already explained, checking for the STROBE-MR checklist and the basic methodology, only a fraction of the submissions that we get actually proceeds to our academic editors. Which is something that we're quite happy about, because when we were being flooded with so many submissions, we fully understand that our academic editors and also our reviewers do struggle with sort of handling that amount of information, the amount of studies. But having narrowed it down to only submissions that appear to already have better quality, we are hopefully able to reduce the number. We have already been able to reduce the number of MR studies that proceed to assignment. I can see that there have been some comments made in the chat, which is great, about the validation. I will go through this in detail after the meeting and see if anything of it also requires a response. And this is sort of the last thing that I would like to propose to you and go through, is we have realized, while being in communication with a lot of our academic editors throughout developing these policies, that often there is a sense for there is something lacking in these studies, but it's hard to put your finger on what the actual problem is. And so in order to provide you with guidance that can help you assess if the submission sort of has value and can contribute and is suitable for publication or eventual publication, we have put together a list of sort of items to consider when you try to decide if a study is worth being sent out for peer review. Now, I'm just going to quickly end the previous poll. I think we have the most votes. It's a close call, but we have the most votes for the validation using data derived from clinical and observational studies, which sort of goes very hand in hand with what we would have expected. All right. Going through these items, the idea with these items is that when you as academic editors decide to handle one of the MR study submissions, then you would also be sent this list of considerations just to support you in assessing the study before you want to make the decision if you send it out for peer review or not. The first one would be to see if the authors have provided a plausible biological or theoretical basis for the presented association. This sort of goes hand in hand with what we've discussed in the beginning with publication criteria too. Just because this is an association that no one has looked into yet, that's not enough. That's not enough to judge if this study should be conducted. So this feeds into that. Have the authors proposed a specific and unique research question that has not been previously asked and answered with similar methodology? So this research question should be contributing something new. The third one would be to see if the authors have cited and discussed relevant literature on this topic, because in order to be a good submission, the reference literature should always be up to date. The key references must be included, and this is commonly something that is lacking with a lot of MR study submissions, where the references tend to be outdated or just not present. The fourth one is if the authors discussed sample size calculation, because evidently for a study like this, the sample size has to be quite large, and usually is because you use the entire GWS set, so that has a whole lot of participants. But what tends to be lacking is the authors actually justifying their choice for sample size or explaining how they arrived at this. So it's a question, this is also covered by the MR checklist, if the authors have mentioned this at all. The next one would be if the authors have used the appropriate GWS source. There are two things to look for in this, one being if the population actually matches your research question, if that fits, and if it is the most up-to-date GWS set, because there is very little point in using an old data set that might be flawed simply by the fact that sampling technologies or strategies were not as refined as they are now. If there is something more up-to-date that could be used to answer the question just as well. Because this can often bring issues with the generalizability of the findings, or it can lead to confounding factors that have not been discussed, and therefore the results might not be as strong as they're being presented. And feeding into this, if authors argue that they detect a causality between an outcome and an exposure, the question is if they have performed some sort of validation to strengthen their findings, or at the very least critically discuss their results in the context of previous, preferentially non-computational studies, because it would be nice to have validation of findings in a setup that isn't non-computational, not exclusively computational. And this, for example, we've mentioned the fintech dataset before. This can lead to a lack of generalizability, which is always problematic with the results. And then, of course, if the study limitations on the strength of the study outcome have been thoroughly discussed, because we do expect the authors to not just provide a generic Mendelian randomization studies can have the following limitations, but really do this critically in light of their own findings, so that we know they have sort of in-depth considered these limitations. Now, this is the final poll I have for you. which basically we would like to know that if we provide you with this list when you agree to handle Mendelian randomization studies, would this be helpful in your decision making? And we understand that some of those are redundant with the Mendelian randomization, with the strobe MR checklist, but hopefully, yes, okay, I can see that the response is sort of overwhelmingly positive, which is very good, because that will help us put in place a policy that will just give you these questions as you agree to handle the studies. Now, while this is running, this has sort of reached the end of the formal presentation, and I hope I've been able to give you a good idea of the challenge that we're facing and what we're trying to do to help us and you and the scientific community in general to sort of ensure that these publications, once they reach an accept status, are of sufficient quality. I have a few points in the Q&A section. These are questions that have been asked at registration, which makes sense to sort of share with all of you. I'm going to let the poll run because we can. The first question that came up a few times was about how to get reliable reviewers for these submissions. And we know that sometimes obtaining reviews is a really big challenge, and we really appreciate all the effort that you put into this always. Specifically, what we hope is that by already reducing the amount of Mendelian randomization studies so significantly that we actually send to you, and then you can assess them and decide if you send them out for review. By reducing that number, hopefully it will be much easier going forward to find reviewers, because the reviewers don't get flooded with these study types that excessively. What I would always recommend when you look for reviewers is to find someone with epidemiological experience, because they are best suited to evaluate the methodology that is chosen. And of course, always the subject-specific reviewers, because the aspect of sort of up-to-date literature and what this contributes is usually best assessed by them. Okay, I see that we have a few comments in the chat, but that we can go through later. Continuing, this was a question that came up often, and I understand that the current use of AI tools is quite a critical subject, and it's obviously something that concerns the entire scientific community, because it poses both good and potentially problematic challenges. And we were asked how to identify Mendelian randomization studies that might be written by AI. We do have internal checks. These manuscripts, as I've mentioned before, they're all being looked at. So hopefully we will spot problematic manuscripts and be able to deal with them before they actually advance towards you. But every once in a while, it can happen that you'll be invited for a manuscript that has sort of slipped through our net, or we're not entirely sure. And this is something where we also very much rely on your editorial feeling and your knowledge of the topic and the subject matter. Because when you read the manuscript and you get the feeling that this might be AI generated, there might be a problem with it, we really strongly encourage you to just contact us with your concerns, so that we can then have a deep dive into the topic and just assess this again and make sure if it is AI written or not. This is something that is currently under development, because there are no 100% reliable tools to detect AI-generated context with absolute certainty. What I would like to mention is that even if done with the best intentions, when you have doubts, please don't upload the manuscripts to a server or a service or provider that will tell you if there is a degree of AI writing in it, because that is usually a confidentiality issue. So rather than doing that, the moment you have doubts, just contact us about it, and we will try our best to assess the issue. Then there was a question which I thought was really interesting, which was about if there is a way to cross-check the results that are proposed by the authors. And that is really difficult to do for MR studies, because it is basically just one experiment. And if it is just one experiment, that there's nowhere else to sort of look if there's something similar. Now, the author should be validating their results with findings from literature. They should be discussing this in a critical context. But hopefully, once we get a requirement for validation and the authors need to provide at least sort of a second experiment to validate and corroborate their findings, this should improve how much we can rely on the results that are being proposed by the authors. And finally, this is an important question that has come up multiple times as well. How do we know if this study type is adequately powered? Now, this is, again, really tricky to do because this varies with every single study and with every single research question. However, the authors really should be telling us. And there is an item on the Strobe-Mar checklist, it's item 4B, where it says whether any power sample size calculations were carried out prior to the main analysis. And this is something the authors really should be mentioning. It is not enough to just say we have taken this GWS set with so and so many participants and we're going to describe it. There should be a justification somewhere why it's been chosen and how this has been determined. And speaking of all of these points and also the items of considerations, when you decide to handle an MR study, and you are a bit unsure about any of these points, and you're inviting reviews, you are absolutely encouraged to request further information from the authors during revision. So, for example, if they haven't explained the sample size calculation, but you generally feel that this submission has merit, just edit to your comments to the authors, and they should be responding to it, hopefully, when they submit revised versions of the manuscripts. These are all the points that have come up so far. Here are just a few more thinking points. If you have any expertise or any opinions to share, we would absolutely like to hear your thoughts on how on the policies I've described, on how PLOS One does handles these MR submissions, on your thoughts on validation, also what you would generally consider a high-quality Mendelian randomization study. We can talk about the proposed items for consideration for these submissions, and generally anything else that has crossed your mind. Feel free to chat with us about it now, or just add any comments you may have to the survey at the end. And just because I've seen the question in the chat, we will share the slides via email. There will also be a link to the recording of the presentation. And if I can if I can find any other questions in the chat that we haven't gone through yet, then there will also include answers to those in the follow-up email. That being said, I'm going to stop the recording now. And